Well, all right. Hello, everyone. As you know, this is my favorite part when I see the number of participants ticking in. Thank you for coming. Welcome to everyone. It is the last days of June. We are winding down Pride Month, and summer is off to a delightful start. And so I wish you a happy swim a lap day, which I will be celebrating as Take a Bubble Bath Day. It's also Adopt a Cat Month, which I'm sure, from the perspective of our benevolent feline overlords, is Adopt a Human Month. And I am one of those lucky bipeds, four legs good, two legs bad. And so, welcome, one and all, to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. Yay! My name is Leanne Lord, and I am really delighted to be your host. I am a stand up comedian and author, and I'm also co host for the Point of Inquiry podcast. If you are so inclined, you can find out more about me and my work at veryfunnylady.com. And before we get going, I have a couple of reminders for you. The Coronavirus Resource Center is still curating reliable news at centerforinquiry.org/coronavirus. This week, Science-Based Medicine has an article about the new Delta variant. You should check that out if you want to get up on your knowledge. And Vox has a very disturbing story about the toll that the pandemic has taken on the mental health of doctors. It was touching, and I do recommend it. It's a good read. And for you baseball fans out there, here is the windup and the pitch. If you have not already, please round out your reading list by subscribing to Skeptical Inquirer magazine. Yes. And of course, there are now two ways to do that: it's digital and print. And here's the thing: if you get the print subscription, it gives you access to the digital version as well. So you can get either or both at skepticalinquirer.org. And while you're taking notes, please mark your calendar for the next Skeptical Inquirer Presents on July 8th. Seth Shostak. I always have a hard time with that. It's a superhero name, so I should be good. But Seth Shostak will be here and positing the question, why look for ET light years away if he's already in our airspace? I would amend that to say if he, she, or they are already in our airspace, since we don't know how said aliens would like to be addressed. I mean, that could mean the difference between world peace or human annihilation. Why take the chance? Now, if you're new here, here's the deal. The flow of the evening is easy. You get to keep doing whatever you're doing, and I'll introduce our guest. They'll razzle and dazzle. And after that, we will open it up for your questions. You guys probably already know this, but in case I have any newbies, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little icon that says Q&A, and that's the place for you to type your questions in the form of a question. Please take it easy on my eyes in this sans serif font. And if you miss any of the talk tonight, it is being recorded and will be available on skepticalinquirer.org. And now, everybody, our guest this evening is a physicist, cancer researcher, and author. He has a strong focus on public understanding of science and medicine, and I'm grateful for that. And he's contributed to the New York Times, the Scientific American, the Guardian, the Irish Times, and PBS. He received the 2014 Maddox Prize for Communicating Science in the Face of Adversity. And his first book, I think I have it here, Good Thinking: Why Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk and How Critical Thinking Can Save the World. That is a bold but awesome statement and a great title. And so, you guys, here we go. He is here to share why the need for critical thinking is indeed so critical. So please welcome Dr. David Robert Grimes. David, you have the con.
Hi, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to try and live up to the bold statement that critical thinking can save the world. I didn't know it was Adopted Cat and Bubble Bath Month, and I hope you don't mix those two things up, because I don't think cats are big fans of that. I'm going to try and do the trickiest part of the evening, which is a screen share. And if we go well here, it bodes well. So let's see how we get on in this. This is always the most dangerous moment of any Zoom presentation. And let's see how we're getting on. Bad start. Can't get it started properly. Now we will now. Now, apologies. This is why we usually get it set up beforehand. And I was told to, but I never listen. All right, folks. So I won't spend too long introducing myself, because I've already got a wonderful introduction. Please, if I speak too fast, do tell me. I am Irish. I do have a tendency to overspeak. I want to talk to you all tonight about critical thinking. I don't think I have to sell how important it is, but I want to justify the statement made there about saving the world. Now, some of you might know who this person is, and a lot of you won't. Don't worry. This is the same person, by the way. This is a young version and an older version. By the way, you can all see my screen, I hope. If anyone can't, just put it in the chat window and scream at me. Hopefully we can see that fine. This guy is a guy called Stanislaw Petrov. Stanislaw Petrov in 1983 was working at a Russian bunker where he, has a chat window already saying, oh, excellent, we're good, great. So he was working in a Russian bunker, working on a thing called the OKO, which was the Russians' eye on its enemy. It was a missile detector. It was state of the art, absolutely fantastic kit. And he was the duty commander on board. And one September morning in 1983, he got a message saying that 5 American missiles were inbound. Now, this was a time of unspeakable tension. As an audience of primarily Americans, I don't have to tell you about the tensions of a Cold War. But just a few months before this happened, the USSR had been called an evil empire by Ronald Reagan, and diplomatic tensions were at an all-time high, and people really were quite terrified of the prospect of nuclear war. And suddenly here in Moscow in September 1983, the unthinkable is happening. War has begun. Petrov's job was to pick up the phone, ring Soviet high command, and give them the news. Their response would have been inevitable. They would have had to respond in kind and launch an all-out attack on America. At the same time, every other nation on the planet would be targeted by both superpowers to try and nullify any potential advantage for the survivors that would maybe live and vie to rule the ashes. This was an incredibly dangerous moment. Now, as you all know, the world did not end in 1983, because Petrov picked up that phone and he made a different phone call. He actually reported the detector as faulty. Now, his colleagues were aghast, because they were like, you were ceding the advantage to the Americans here. This is insane. But he had a very simple reasoning for this. He argued that if America was going to attack, they wouldn't use a paltry 5 missiles, which could be shot down. Their only logical strategy would be an all-out attack. He then made a separate inquiry about whether the ground radar corroborated the 5 missiles he saw. It didn't. Weighing this up, he decided he wasn't going to take the risk of ending the world, and he reckoned the detector was faulty. He was correct. The 5 missiles it saw were actually clouds being reflected, right? And now you'd think that there would be a lot of people that, oh, Petrov, and he was probably should have been lauded for this. He was not. He was reprimanded by Soviet high command for not making a phone call and telling them this. He actually was so demoralized, he left the military and went into civilian research, and his story didn't become common knowledge until only a few years ago, I think 2017. And I think that this is someone, he said up to his death, he would have said he was only doing his job. I think maybe that's true, but can you imagine if someone less reflective and less critically attuned had been trying to do that? Believe it or not, this is nowhere near the most dangerous part of the war. Only a few years before that, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Russian sub, the B-59, that was being pursued by the USS Randolph destroyer. And it had dived too deep to communicate with Moscow. And the USS Randolph started dropping depth charges to try and get the Soviets to surface. What they didn't know when they were doing this is that there was a single 15 kiloton nuclear missile on torpedo inside the B-59. And they had autonomy. They could launch it. They had the permissions to launch it if they had good reason to suspect so. and they needed the political officer and the captain to agree, which they both did. But they also had the flotilla commander on board, this very handsome Russian gentleman here you can see in the picture, called Vasily Arkhipov. And Vasily Arkhipov reasoned quite sensibly, for us, we should say, that if they were to launch that missile, they would most definitely cause World War III. If they didn't know and didn't have enough information to ascertain whether World War III was happening, then he argued resolutely he was vetoing their request. It actually ended up in a fist fight, would you believe, on this sub, which had gone to 50 degrees Celsius. I think it's over 100 Fahrenheit, and oxygen had fallen dangerously low, not situations conducive to critical thinking. I love the way that Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. describes it, not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, the most dangerous moment in human history. Thomas Blankton, director of National Security Archive, just said, a guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. These were two men that in high tension, terrifying situations where it's easy to lose one's head, both used their cool critical reasoning, and I would say, and argue strongly, they saved the world by doing that. But we should also see the converse of what happens when we fail to do that, because unfortunately that happens too. This gentleman in the corner is Chairman Mao. When the communists took over China in the 1950s after a long war, they wanted to modernize. They wanted to bring this agrarian economy up to a modern industrial society. And they had an audacious plan to do this called the Great Leap Forward. Now, the Great Leap Forward was very ambitious, for sure, but it also had a few weird suggestions. They wanted to eradicate 4 types of pests. They wanted to get rid of flies because they spread disease, mosquitoes for spreading disease, rats for spreading disease. Absolutely sensible. But they also, to this rogues gallery, added something unusual. The humble Eurasian tree sparrow, this little cutie up here in the corner. They were incredibly successful, by the way. They decided to get rid of these pests because they had political resonance. To them, the sparrows were eating grain that the farmers had actually worked on. They actually called them animals of the bourgeois enemy of the proletariat. They gave them a political resonance. The sparrows probably just thought they were eating some grain, but there you go. And they raised a force, a massive force, millions strong, to destroy sparrows across the country. In Beijing alone, they had a force of 3 million people. They banged pots and pans to scare the birds into the air. They'd fly around till they died of exhaustion. Within a year, they'd killed 1 billion of them. And they'd virtually eradicated them in China. So great success, right? Not so much. You see, what the ornithologists had tried to tell Mao, and he actually had one of them arrested for telling him this, that when you autopsy the birds, they weren't really eating that much grain. Their main dietary source of food was insects. And there was some people that tried to warn Mao that maybe it was a bad idea to pursue this without thinking about potential ramifications. Without any sparrows, the locust population in China had no natural predator apart from them. It exploded. Absolutely devastating crop yields in 1958, 1959, leading to the Great Chinese Famine, which has killed, or did kill, between 15 and 45 million people. And I think this is the consequence of when critical thought becomes afterthought. So we also live in an era where we really need to know this a lot. We all work online and we all deal with people online. And you might have noticed the internet's kind of angry. We've become incredibly binarized. Things split into, I hate to use the Trumpian phrase, but fake news and disinformation, viral propaganda has been a huge issue over previous few years. And this leaves us more and more confused. But it also means that critical thinking is more and more important than it ever has been if we're to overcome the ravages and the dangers that we see with it. And also, I always made this point for years. I've talked about conspiracy theories in my research an awful lot. But what I try to point out to people is our own, so that should be hat, by the way, not tinfoil hate. That's my subconscious. That's a Freudian slip. But I try to point out to people that we used to think conspiracy theorists and people that held strange beliefs were, living in a basement with their tinfoil hats. But there are cousins, there are mothers, there are brothers, there are fathers. We know this from the pandemic. These are just some statistics on, um, you know, conspiracy theories associated with COVID-19, which are widely believed in both America and the US, for example. So America and the US, America and the UK, and across most of Europe. Belief in some countries goes up over 50%. So we really live in an era where disinformation perpetuates. And I want to talk about why we get things wrong, and then maybe how we can adjust that. So there's a beautiful thing. First thing, I think reasoning is something that we're not as good as we think we are. I love that quote, by the way. He who will not reason is a bigot. He who cannot is a fool. And he who dares not is a slave. This is a beautiful quote. So I want to tell you about the medieval papacy. So I'm going to jump back in time to the year, I think it was 892, or 897 actually. And it was a strange time. The medieval church made Game of Thrones look a bit like, a children's TV show. It was properly bloody. There was loads of murder going on. Everyone was up to no good in different ways. And in the middle of this, there was a very famous case, which I love going back to. And there was one pope putting another pope on trial. So Pope Stephen the Sixth or Seventh, depending on how you count your anti-popes, was thundering accusations of perjury and nepotism and all this kind of stuff at his predecessor, Pope Formosus. Pope Formosus did not react. He was not given anything. And as Stephen thunders these accusations, oh, something came up there. Things are happening all the time. And every time he puts a new accusation towards Formosus, Formosus says nothing, just keeps it quiet. And in the end, Stephen turns around to the jury of learned men and says, an innocent man would defend himself. Pope Formosus has not defended himself, and therefore we should find him guilty. And guess what? They did find him guilty. But I think we have to remember that in Pope Formosus's defense, he had been dead for a full 8 months before the trial actually began. Now, they didn't waste any time. They still found him guilty. They cut off 3 fingers on his right hand so he couldn't perform any blessings, and they threw his body into the Tiber. It was briefly rescued by monks and worshipped as a holy relic. And also, it didn't really work out that well for Stephen either, because by the end of that summer, he was murdered by a few of his closest friends, as we are often wont to be. Now, of course, Stephen wasn't an idiot. He knew that this was a spurious argument, but he knew it had enough of a veneer of logic that he could fool people with it, and he could give a superficial justification for something absolutely devoid of any justice. And I think one of the weirdest ironies for me on this, Formosus translates roughly as handsome. I can't imagine 8 months post-mortem he was particularly fresh. Anyway, this is an example of a veneer of logic fooling us. And the research does tell us that if we think something is logically robust, we're more likely to be fooled by it. I come across this with conspiracy theorists an awful lot. So, for example, you all are probably familiar with 9/11 truthers. And it doesn't matter how many reports come out, whether it's a NIST report or Popular Mechanics debunking all the canards you've probably heard, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. And then you point out it doesn't have to, it just has to make them really weak, which it does. At the temperatures in the Twin Towers, those steel beams would have been at 10% of their normal tensile strength. They would have folded like spaghetti that's been overcooked. It doesn't matter. And one of the reasons why there's a faulty logic behind this, their argument is if there's a cover-up, official reports will undermine it. Then you give them a report that says your claims are wrong. And they use that as a bizarre supporting argument for there being a cover-up. They turn an absence of evidence into evidence. And of course, this is a classic, antecedent fallacy right here. It's a total mistake in logic, but it's superficially convincing enough that it can turn a paucity of evidence into an illusion of evidence. We see this a lot, by the way. We have other all or nothing falsehoods are really common, or the fallacy of the undistributed middle. I do a lot of work on 5G, or public understanding of cancer and radiation. And a lot of stuff you see is people pointing out absolutely correctly that obviously radio frequency radiation is a form of light. It's just a much lower energy light than visible light. But then you have high energy forms of light, like X-ray, which are so high energy they can do DNA damage. And people make this mistake. They go, all radio frequency radiation is electromagnetic radiation. Absolutely true. That's a correct premise. Then they hear that some electromagnetic radiation can cause cancer. Also true. I mean, you don't want to be exposed to X-rays or cosmic rays unless you need to. And then they conclude from that radio frequency radiation causes cancer. Of course, you can't do that. The middle premise doesn't have an explicit distribution, but it's very easy for people to fall victim to this. And I see it an awful lot with well-meaning people falling for it. But I don't think this is the biggest factor. I think rhetorical falsehoods, where you give a bit of information out of context, is possibly a much more malignant kind of example. I'll give you another example from the cancer realm as well. For example, I think if you've ever Googled cannabis and cancer, if you've ever been that way inclined, you'll find a whole army of people claiming that cannabis is a miracle cure, that it's brilliant. Here's just some screenshots I picked up Googling it the other day, right? And what they will say, which is absolutely correct, but misleading, is they will tell you that, oh, well, THC, which is the psychoactive component in cannabis, if you put it on a Petri dish, it kills cancer cells. That is absolutely true. So does bleach. So does water. So does sneezing on them. So does accidentally putting the incubator at the wrong temperature by 1 or 2 degrees. So does literally pretty much anything you have lying around the lab. But the astute listener here will know that humans aren't petri dishes. A cancer killing agent is only effective if you can put it into someone's body and it selectively kills cancer cells and spares, or relatively spares, healthy cells. So the fact that it can kill this in isolation does not prove what the argument implicitly seems to make it do. And that's a rhetorical fact. This is a fact out of context to give an illusion of something else. And the reason this really bothers me, and this is very common in a lot of alternative medicine regimes, particularly for cancer, and it really bothers me. I'm going to show you why. This is a slide from Skylar Johnson in JAMA Oncology, a medical journal, about 3 years ago. And he looked at patients who used complementary medicine and those who did not use complementary medicine for breast, prostate, lung, or colorectal cancer. So some of the most common cancers. And I'm not sure, this is a survival curve. And essentially, to give you the breakdown of this, patients that were seduced by claims of alternative medicine had twice the hazard ratio of dying within 5 years as people that did not. And the reason for that is they often delayed their conventional treatment or rejected it. So this kind of dishonest presentation of a fact devoid of context has consequences like this, which bothers me. The other classical rhetorical fallacy, there's so many of them, and in the book I cover a lot, but I'm only going to speak out a few tonight because I'm already speaking at you very fast. But the other ones, and we've seen it during the pandemic, and it just drives me up the wall, is the fallacy of the argument from authority. So of course there are authorities, like when a scientist is speaking or a doctor, they're only ever speaking with any authority when they're reflecting the evidence base. But during the pandemic, we've seen plenty of people. We've seen Judy Mekovich, for example, with Plandemic, someone who does have a scientific qualification, but is not speaking from the scientific evidence base. We've seen Andrew Wakefield. I won't spend too long on that awful individual. We've seen plenty of these people, some of these other faces you'll recognize too. I wrote about this for Scientific American recently, who use their credentials to try and imply that their argument is robust because their credentials. But I think people have to realize if a scientist or doctor is not preaching from the evidence base, their qualifications are basically confetti. It doesn't matter. The only authority they ever have is reflecting the evidence base. But yet they will abuse that as a rhetorical argument to fool other people. But why do we fall for it? Why are we so privy to this kind of stuff? Why are we so susceptible, I guess? So I've just been looking at some of the COVID-19 stuff, which we're all sick of. I know, but we need to talk about it a little bit. So you've probably seen some of this. COVID-19 is a hoax. 5G is the killer. Lock up the criminal. I like this one. It's a hoax brought to you by Satan. He's gone to a lot of work for this. Good man, Satan. But I think we need to talk about the human psychology behind a lot of this because it's something we cannot overlook. And to understand that, we need to go back to the 1950s and join a UFO cult. So this man up in the corner is Leon Festinger, pioneering psychologist in the 50s. And I love this quote: "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts and figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point." Festinger was a pioneer in researching a thing called motivated reasoning. He wanted to know why people still hold beliefs when the evidence is so strongly against them. And he was living in Chicago at the time, and he read a newspaper article that said, I think it was 1954, it could have been 1956, it's right in the book, I don't remember what it is in my head, that said that there was a UFO cult who believed the world was going to end on the 21st of December. And he went, this sounds like a great ethical experiment to put my PhD and postdoc students into. And the days when ethics weren't the big thing. So he sent his students to go and live with this UFO cult undercover to document what happened as their beliefs were disconfirmed. And of course, the world did not end on December 21st. I hope that's not a spoiler to anyone, but it didn't. And he had people in there documenting everything. A lot of these people had given up their homes. They'd really committed to this. They'd given up their possessions, their marriages, sometimes their children. And When the world didn't end, they went away and had a bit of a crisis of faith for a few hours. And then they came out absolutely convinced that the world had not ended because their faith was so strong that God had spared the world because of them. And they became actually keener evangelists than before, more convinced despite the disconfirmation. And Festinger described this as motivated reasoning. Essentially, this is really wanting to believe something and only amplifying, confirming evidence, downplaying evidence that doesn't agree with your hypothesis, and then bending facts to fit a narrative that keeps your belief in check, that doesn't make you uncomfortable that maybe you were wrong. We see this in politics all the time. Take something like climate change. So we know that 77% of Democrats disagree with the statement that global warming is a hoax. I wonder what the other 23% are doing. I hope it's just, well, it's 58% of Republicans in the last survey believe climate change is a hoax, because that is very much a political issue. Of course, we all remember Donald J. Trump's famous tweet on this, that global warming was created by the Chinese to make US manufacturing non-competitive. So why do people believe in this? There's a psychological component to this ideological stuff. So I did a paper on this a few months ago, and I think that there's some reasons that people believe in conspiracy theory. One is they give them epistemic certainty. They give you a reason that you're confident in your belief. They make you feel like you understand stuff, even when you don't, when you really don't. We're also quite adverse to randomness. Weirdly enough, it's easier for some people to accept that Bill Gates or someone was behind the pandemic than to accept that random viruses mutate all the time and sometimes they cause pandemics, because that's too random. That's very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And we'll talk a little bit later on why egotism is a huge factor. I mean, you meet a lot of very arrogant conspiracy theorists, you might have realized, who are very confident in their beliefs. There's a reason for that, and we will talk about that in a little while. I want to ask you finally on this one, though, what do these two people have in common? This is Diana, Princess of Wales, People's Princess, bad at seatbelts, that one. And this is Osama bin Laden, Beard of the Year 2002, or something like that. Obviously, no, terrorist leader, Al Qaeda cell. What do these people have in common? Well, actually, what they have in common is that they are the focus of an awful lot of conspiracy theories. And a friend of mine and a fantastic researcher, Karen Douglas, looked at people that really believe Diana conspiracies, and she gave them two different versions of a narrative. In one, the Queen Mother had Diana killed because she didn't like her. And in another version of a narrative, Diana had faked her own death because she felt ostracized from the royal family. People that really believed in conspiracy theories could simultaneously believe these two narratives at once. They had some kind of Schrodinger's princess that was both alive and dead, which was fascinating. And the same with bin Laden. People that believed in a bin Laden conspiracy could at the same time accept he was both alive and dead, so long as there was a conspiracy theory. And they gave the paper a fantastic name, Dead and Alive, Beliefs in Contradictory Conspiracy Theories. And what I think is absolutely incredible is this shows that sometimes people are really motivated just because they want to believe, like Fox Mulder in the X-Files. They want to believe, and just as long as they think they know about a conspiracy, they're not concerned about the consistency of that. We've seen this during COVID. I've heard people in the same breath, and I'm sure you have too, go, COVID is a hoax, but it's caused by 5G, and you can cure it with ivermectin. And you're like, buddy, these are mutually incompatible statements. But if you're wondering why they're incompatible, it's because that's not what's motivating them. The psychological belief is that they want to believe they know something, which is a lot stronger. Another reason we get things wrong is that we're bad at numerical reasoning. Right? I love this quote, by the way. Politicians use statistics in the same way that a drunk uses lampposts, for support rather than illumination. Andrew Lang. Absolutely love that quote. I actually had the pleasure of saying it to an Irish politician recently who was a bit miffed. So here's an example I like to give my students. So this is about 20 years ago. Roughly a third of us in the Western world, and I use that phrase loosely, in the privileged world, if you will, about a third of us, 1 in 3, would get cancer in our lifetime. That has now gone to 1 in 2, and it may go even higher. And this is a graph from many years ago, and you can see rough predictions. So I would ask my students, what's happening in the world? Is something making the world more carcinogenic? And what might it be? And people argue and they debate, and the actual answer is just this. We have a lot less of this. Cancer is a disease primarily of aging. Primarily. The longer you live, the more chances there are for your cells to develop mutations that eventually lead to a cancer. If you're not dying of cholera, if you're not dying of tuberculosis, if you're not dying of poverty, effectively in a lot of places, the longer you live, the more cancers you have. So perversely, that increase in cancer is actually indicative of a healthier society. That's weird, counterintuitive, but it shows how we can be fooled by numbers in isolation. We've talked a lot during the pandemic about medical testing, and I love this example. I really love it because the numbers are so neat. So take something like HIV, right? The Western ink blot ELISA test for HIV is often described as 99.99% accurate. In fact, it's 100% sensitive and about 99.99% specific. So very, very good test. We won't go into too much definition about what they are unless people want to in the Q&A. I'll skip over the statistics for now. If you go in and you're the average low risk person, which is most of us, unless you're a heavy IV drug user, you're probably relatively low risk. If you go in to get tested and you get a positive test, what are the chances you have HIV? The vast majority of people, including medical doctors, will think it's very, very high. It's actually around 50%. How does that work? And this is actually a consequence of a thing called Bayes' theorem, which is how you deal with conditional probability and why it's not intuitive at all. So what we did need to know as well, the bit of information I didn't give you, is how prevalent is HIV? And it turns out about 1 in 10,000 low-risk people will have HIV. So let's imagine they all walk in to get tested. Well, one of them has it, and they will flag positive for sure, okay? In the remaining 9,999 who are negative, the test is really good, but it's not perfect. So you're going to get one positive result, even though it's not a real positive. So what are you left with? You're left with 2 positive results, only one of which is a true positive. 1 and 2, 50%. That absolutely bamboozles people, that the incidence or the prevalence of a disease affects the accuracy of a test. You can see it too if you took high-risk people, so IV drug users, with a rate of about 1.5%. That means about 150 in 10,000 will have it. If you do a test then, the 150 who have it, they absolutely flag as positive. They come up as that. In the remaining 9,850, you get about 1 that comes up as a false positive. So now if you have a positive test, your odds of having HIV are 150 over 151, which is about 99.34%. That is crazy because the prevalence in those groups are different. That's why a lot of the COVID stuff, when people get confused about false positives and false negatives, is because they haven't maybe been exposed to this kind of thinking before, this Bayesian kind of reasoning. And it means that it's not straightforward to interpret this stuff. So people understandably get quite confused. So stats in isolation can very much misguide us. There's a great quote by my fellow countryman, George Bernard Shaw, and he said, newspapers are unable seemingly to discriminate between a bicycle accident and the collapse of civilization. Now, he might have been a bit harsh, our George, but he made a certain point with a lot of resonance. One of the things I think we have to be acutely aware of is that the triumvirate that we used to have in media, television, radio, and newspapers is no longer the dominant force. About 60% of us get our news primarily online these days. And I think in millennials, so people around my age, I'm a geriatric millennial. That's a depressing term, but there you go. They get it almost exclusively from social media. And that is a weird prism to reflect things through, because we'll talk a little bit about why that's weird. One of the things the Columbia Journalism Review found in a 2016 examination with the problem with online stuff is that qualified news is mixed with unchecked information and opinions. Rumors and gossip get in the flow, which they call digital fragmentation. And of course, journalistic companies cutting their costs, can't do as much fact checking. They also found that non-fact-based opinions and rumors accelerate the behavior of taking a like or dislike. Instead of people differentiating the source and the quality of it, they tend to accept more unconditionally. So this is a big wall of text. Don't worry too much about it. But they found this digital fragmentation problem increased polarization. Suddenly people were divided where they hadn't been before, and that issues with a lot of nuance suddenly came very polarized, as in like there was 2 sides, when actually there was once a spectrum of opinion. And this is really incredible. And I want to talk about something I find really interesting. Firstly is the extent of this, right? The absolute extent of it is stunning. A study in Science in 2018, the journal Science, found by analyzing 126,000 different news stories that no matter what metric you used, that falsehood, rumors, and outright lies perpetuated far more and far further than actual reliable information. And that was on pretty much all topics, in particular topics about politics, but it was also amplified in health and science to a huge degree. So this has been a growing problem for some time that we've been aware of, but we're not well equipped to deal with it. The biggest single predictor of whether something is shared online or not is if it invokes strong feelings. So particularly disgust and outrage, which we will come back to. And I always point out that social media companies have been aware of this for a long time. And clickbait headline writers are very much aware of this. They know what gets shared. They know if it makes us angry. And this is a problem with humans. We are primed to react before we reflect. We're also looking for that social kudos as well, where we want to interact with people and feel a sense of community. And that has made us very, very vulnerable to social media. Now, the mistakes in reasoning and information literacy have always been there, but social media has accelerated them. It's like the amphetamine system of this. It's really quite extreme what it has done to how we parse information. We also know that we are far more likely to react to visceral emotive anecdotes than we are to state information. And there was a great study done in 2019 on this. And the way they did this is they gave people the same information about an immoral event. And they gave it, and some people in a newspaper, some people read it online, and some people heard it on a mimed radio broadcast. And what they actually found is that online always triggered stronger feelings because there was a social component where people wanted to join in a shared outrage or a sense of cathartic anger. And I do feel that risks making us be engines of outrage where productive decisions can be definitely held back from it. This is an interesting area still in its infancy, but it's certainly something maybe we'll talk about towards the end of the talk if we have time. We'll come back to a little bit about how that works. But I want to give you a good example of what happens in this new information age, how we acquire information. Outside of the UK and even inside of the UK, I wouldn't expect people to know this woman very well, but I found her case fascinating. This woman is called Sally Roberts, and the young child, her son, is called Neon Roberts, as in, yeah, the element, that one there. And in 2012, Neon had a brain tumor. Now it was curable, but he needed radiation. With radiation, very good chance he'd live. Sally was more on the alternative mindset, and she did not want her son to get this treatment. Her husband very much, or her estranged husband very much did. What actually happened is in December of that year, Sally abducted Neon and sparked a UK-wide manhunt. Eventually, they were 4 days later. He was basically very, very close to having a very adverse event. So there was a full manhunt to get the child back. He was 7 years old at the time. Eventually, he was apprehended near Sussex, I think. And when they brought him back, Sally mounted a court case to not have him treated. And eventually, a judge ruled time was of the essence and gave a mandate to treat him. And one of the things I found when Sally was questioned after the thing, now Neon, by the way, made a full recovery. I don't want people worrying about Neon. He got the radiation, full recovery, all good. But when Sally was asked why she had these beliefs, she gave some interesting answers. And her quote, and I want to read it to you, is death by doctor is very common, but thankfully, because of the internet these days, a number of us have educated ourselves. There are so many other options that we've been deprived of, denied. Now, Sally had gone online and found people that claimed they could treat his tumor with Reiki and magical healing crystals. One of them had even spelt the tumor name wrong. Obviously, he just got onto Wikipedia and haphazardly copied it. That was in the court document. I found that really disturbing to read. And the thing is, I have some sympathy for Sally because this is the new frontier of information. I don't condone her, but I need to put her life in perspective here. So, for example, if you go to naturalnews.com, some of you will be familiar with Mike Adams and his little empire. He will say the cancer industry is estimated at a $200 billion a year industry. There are many in various associated positions within that industry who would be without a job if that cash flow dried up suddenly, with the news that there are cheaper, less harmful, and more efficacious remedies available. big pharma would virtually vanish. You know, that was naturalnews.com. Joseph Mercola, also infamous, says the cancer epidemic is a dream for big pharma, and their campaigns to silence cancer cures have been fierce. Joseph Mercola, interesting character. We'll talk about him later. Another, I would argue, a charlatan of the highest order, but we'll talk that way. The Alliance for Natural Health wrote that the maverick cancer cures are suppressed by the mainstream. It is very understandable. And if someone goes on and is scared and hears about cancer and they start Googling it and they come across this, all of these websites and people, by the way, will also tell them that radiotherapy, chemotherapy, immunotherapy, they're all poisons. They're all by big pharma. It is entirely understandable this terrifies people. I do a lot of work with vaccine hesitant parents, and we see the exact same thing. They want to do what's best for their kids. They're exposed to all this terrifying stuff. They don't know. And this, to me, is so reprehensible for that reason. By the way, the Alliance for Natural Health are interesting. I'm just going to put them aside because I thought, well, it might amuse you. They once wrote a piece about me, which I love, because they told me that what are the words? He's young, he's hip, he's got cool hair. And I don't know where they got that photograph from, but well done. And anyway, what I loved was this got a bit of a reaction on Twitter because Brian Cox, they said I was in the Skeptic Knighthood with Simon Singh and Brian Cox, and I was welcome to the Skeptic Knighthood there. And Simon took his own take on it and said, I used to do PR for status quo. I don't fully understand that. But this is the kind of stuff that happens. Obviously, anyone against the narrative gets attacked, and I'd be well used to that. But let's take that premise. Let's try to apply critical thinking to Sally's situation and see what we can ascertain from it, right? So premise one, what if there was a cure for cancer? Well, cancer isn't one disease. Cancer is an entire family of maladies, all of which are vastly different. And there's over 200 known types of cancer. The only thing that unites them is that they are all characterized by abnormal division of cells. Some of them respond to chemo, some to radiation, some to nothing, some to other agents. The idea of a single magic bullet is already a little dodgy. So that's the first premise, a little bit skewed. The other thing that we're told is a cure would not be profitable. That's what Joseph Mercola is telling us and all these guys. I hate to break it to them, but just because you find it in nature doesn't mean you can't patent it. If we found out that vitamin D cured cancer tomorrow, every pharma company would be racing to synthesize the active chemical there that did it and to work out the correct dose and do a trial on it so they could sell it. If you have a disease that affects half the Western world, you're going to make a profit on it if you're going to treat it. And again, we know this all the time. This is how drugs are developed. So this is nonsense. The final extreme fringe they have is that cancer rates are manipulated by big pharma. Now, the word cancer is a fascinating one because actually that's Hippocrates' father, often called the father of medicine. And him and physicians of Greek antiquity named it cancer. You might wonder, cancer is a crab. What's up with that? If you know your star signs, because obviously very serious stuff, astrology. Spoiler, not serious stuff, but still. It's because if you let a facial tumor grow for too long and don't do anything to it, it starts protruding from the skin and it looks like little crab feet, little crab legs poking out. For ethical reasons, we do not let that happen anymore. But in Greek antiquity, they didn't know any better. You're a very educated audience, but I'm still going to guess very few of you read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Don't worry about it. I don't either. But this is a bit of paper from, or papyrus, I guess, from Imhotep, the ancient physician, describing how to remove a breast cancer, or actual take it out, about 3,000 years ago. Imhotep was a statesman, physician. He was also the bad guy in The Mummy with Brendan Fraser. Probably not the same person, but great name. So why do people perpetuate these kind of claims? So there's a lot of reasons, right? Firstly, people are scared. They fall for this stuff because they are frightened. That is absolutely true. A lot of you will be familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the observation that people who are very incompetent at an area overrate their ability in that area. I mean, there's a certain confidence that comes with ignorance because you think you know everything. That's definitely a true thing. And also, if you ever notice these claims, they're easy. They as convoluted as they are, they're good guy, bad guy. It's black and white. The universe is rarely that black and white. So the narrative is easy. That's why it's really, really appealing. But finally, I would also argue that ego is a massive factor. You can sit there, if you're a believer in this kind of stuff, and you can sit there, say you're an anti-vaxxer of the highest order, you can sit there with people that are immunologists, people that are physicians, people that are doctors, people that are experts in this field, and still think you know more than them, even though you've never put in the spade work and the time to become an expert. That's hugely appealing to people's egos. There was a study done on French anti-maskers and found that they came from across the political spectrum, but the one thing that united them was that they had an interpretation of themselves as free thinkers who knew more than the government and the health experts. So there you go. And finally, I want to talk about some good news because I've done a lot of things going wrong. So let's just talk about some good things too. Science is a way of trying not to fool yourself. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. It's one of my favorite Feynman quotes. So there's loads of Feynman quotes, but that's one of my favorite ones. Science is trying to be less wrong all the time. That's essentially what it is. So we've seen lots of this kind of stuff. I've alluded to some of it. Here's, lots of kind of propaganda you'll see online. And a lot of this has a resonance to cargo cult science in my mind. And I'll define that very quickly for those of you who haven't heard it. These amazing structures here, they look incredible, don't they? They're grass replicas of real things. And they're on the Pacific Islands, places like Tanna. And during World War II, the natives of those islands hadn't seen modern technology in the way that we understood it. And when the Japanese and the Americans started occupying these islands, they saw incredible things they had never seen before. And like Arthur C. Clarke says, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic if you don't know much about it. So once the Americans left, they wanted the cargo. They wanted this activity, and they started constructing effigies of what they had seen. I think they're incredible, aren't they? The structures are just fantastic. Except no cargo ever came, no planes landed, nothing ever happened. And as Feynman observed, this is because they caught the veneer of science, but they hadn't truly captured what was going on. And we all do that sometimes, and we have to be very careful not to. Just because something looks superficially valid doesn't mean that we've really understood what's going on. And the Tanna Islanders would have learned that. But also when we see a lot of pseudoscience dressed up on the internet, stuff like this, we have to ask ourselves, is this really science, or is this a cheap imitation of it to fool the unwary? And we'll get maybe onto that in a little bit. So a few things I want to leave you with. Firstly, a kind of checklist that I try to go through. Firstly, if it's logic, do all the premises connect? Is there non sequiturs in there? Is it logically rigorous? If someone has given you an argument, do all the bits in the chain connect, or are there missing links? The next thing is always rhetoric. If someone's trying to get you angry, or someone's trying to sell or persuade you of something, are they being fair? Are they representing the arguments of their opponents and themselves accurately? Are they giving you the information in context, or are they trying to skew you towards a particular take on something? The other thing to be aware of is biases, including our own. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about them because I'm limited in how much I can yell at you tonight. But to be aware that we have to question other people rigorously, but we also have to question ourselves very rigorously and go, do I just want this to be true? I find that whenever I go to share a headline, I go, that's exactly what I already believe. And then I have to stop myself and go, hang on a sec. Am I just sharing this because I want to? I better check it first. Measurements, if they are given or quantified, have to be put in context, or we can be misled. I think the most important thing is information hygiene here. Are the sources we're using reliable? If you're talking about, say, COVID stuff, if it's coming from the CDC, it's probably fairly reliable. If it's coming from your racist uncle's Facebook page, maybe decidedly less so. And finally, to quote Jesse Pinkman, yeah, science bitch, if it claims to be science, is it really science, or is it the veneer of science? Is it an argument from authority dressed up as science, or is it an honest attempt to engage with the material? And that's really hard to ascertain, but it is a checklist that is worth keeping in your mind. I'm going to finish up really soon so we can have a chat in a bit, but I want to give you a quote from Voltaire that I love. Everyone knows some of the other quotes, and I use a lot of them in the book because I absolutely love Voltaire. But this one, love truth but pardon error, I think is really important to us as skeptical people and people that like to think about things. It's sometimes easy to forget that mistakes need to be pardoned. And I'm going to give you an example of this in a huge way. The HPV vaccine is an incredible bit of work. 5% of cancers worldwide are caused by human papillomavirus infection, or HPV. And the invention of a vaccine, including cervical cancer, which kills about 270,000 women a year, right? There is a vaccine against this. It exists. It's absolutely fantastic. And it was introduced about a decade ago. Now, in 2013, anti-vaccine propaganda in Japan suddenly started claiming that this vaccine was damaging young women. Of course, it was not, but that was the claim made. Within a year, vaccine uptake went from 70%, which is quite good, to less than 1%. Now it's still in the doldrums, and that's a situation that modeling studies have shown will result in about 11,000 unnecessary deaths in the next 20 years. In Denmark, about a year later, the same propaganda, just reskinned, arrived in Denmark and caused a similar panic when it was picked up by media outlets. Their uptake went from 79% to 17% within a year. In 2015, it came to my home country, Ireland. Now, I was vaguely aware of it. I knew some from the, was vaguely aware of what had happened in Japan. And suddenly claims of adverse effects started appearing in the news, and mothers claiming their children were in wheelchairs and very, very damaged. They got a very sympathetic airing because no one wants to be cruel to mothers who claim their children are suffering. Why would you? It would be cruel. But some of the alarm bells sounded for me because I wrote about vaccination an awful lot, and cancer, obviously. And one of the things I found was that we were hearing a lot of the people claiming to have had children with side effects. If you Googled them, were adamant anti-vaxxers who on different pages had boasted about never giving their children vaccines. So there was huge red flags that a lot of the media outlets missed. So a lot of us, we convened together and we decided to create a HPV Vaccine Alliance. The government got behind it, public health bodies, all that kind of stuff. And they had scientists and then doctors, including myself, writing about it and doing that kind of stuff. And one of the reasons for that is because there is a continuum of vaccine acceptance. People aren't just anti-vax or pro-vax. The vast majority of people are somewhere around here. They're in the middle. They don't really know. They're scared. They hear scary things online and they start going, well, what happens if, I don't believe it, but what happens if something bad happens? Maybe I won't take that risk, not realizing that the risk is in not taking the thing. So we worked very hard to change public perception, but we were hugely, hugely swayed on this by an incredible young woman. So while the scientists and doctors and people like me were out there talking to the public, getting plenty of hate mail for it, I assure you, a young woman who had been diagnosed with cervical cancer contacted the health service executive in Ireland, the HSE, and said, I've been diagnosed with cervical cancer and I'm going to die from this. Before I die, I would like to tell other young women the truth about this illness and why they should get the vaccine and not be like me. That young woman was Laura Brennan. And here she was an absolutely brilliant person. I was so privileged to be close to her. And this is what she said. At 24, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer stage 2B. I was quite optimistic as there was something that could be done. With chemo and radiation, there was a good chance it could be cured. 2 months later, it was back, and things are different this time. There is no treatment that will cure my cancer. There is only treatment that will prolong my life. If anything good comes out of this, I would hope parents get their daughters vaccinated. The vaccine saves lives. It could have saved mine. Laura's impact was absolutely phenomenal because suddenly she had taken these empty threats from anti-vaccine people, these empty scaremongering, and she used to say to people in interviews, I am the reality of an unvaccinated girl. That had a huge effect on changing people's minds, because I'll tell you something. You cannot change minds unless you change hearts as well. People need to see viscerally what the reality of this stuff is. We can give them all the facts and figures, all the statistics in the world, but unless people see why and feel why, it's unlikely to sway them. Laura passed away on the 20th of March 2019, and she was only 26. But she leaves behind an incredible legacy, because now in Ireland, we are the only country of all the affected countries to have had a huge improvement in our vaccine rates in HPV. And people still get the vaccine citing Laura's name. And I think that's really important. And I was very, very privileged to know her and see that. But it's a really important lesson because we're humans. We are irrational apes. We are not machines and automatons. We have feelings and they affect how we interpret things. There's no shame in changing our minds in the light of evidence. There's only shame in refusing to do so, and evidence demands that. But if we're trying to help other people change their mind, we have to give them the freedom to do so and show them why things matter, not just lecture them. Really important is we are not our ideas. Our ideas should be subject to change and frequently altered when required. And all we can do is give people the tools and freedom to change their mind and hope they give us the same. So listen, I've talked to you an awful lot. If you want to find me on social media, and I'm there. If you want to talk about the book, that's there. That's the name of it. And I'm going to turn it back to ye. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions and see what I can answer. So thank you very much for your patience on that weird tour of stuff.
That was not weird at all. That was amazing. Thank you,
Oh, you're
David.
more
Thank
than
you
welcome.
so much. That was, wow, that was so powerful, that woman's story. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, the key to changing mind is changing hearts, because how do you not feel that? Um, let's see. If you stay with me, change your screen. There we go. And
Yeah,
let me
I
change
had to
my
find the button.
view.
It got a bit
Yeah.
lost on me. So
No, 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 no. I totally get it. There's so many points here, and you're right. Not many of us speak or read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, and that is some of us can read emoji though, but it's still a similar struggle in
they're
order.
definitely pictorial representations. I'm sure a linguist could put us right, but I am not one.
No, no, me neither. Me neither. And when you said that about the news that the news sees a bicycle accident as the collapse of civilization, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel seen. Because I'm a catastrophizer. You know, if I sneeze, I'm dying. I mean,
Yeah.
it's terrible. It's terrible. And I almost spit out my coffee when you said Schrodinger's princess. Is she dying? Did she fake her own death? Was it the queen? Is it? I mean, I the desire to be right, enabling us to hold, or the people who believe this to hold those things in their head. It's like, wow, the human brain is amazing and wrong.
An absolute mess, but it's a wonderful mess. But yeah, absolutely.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that. And I love that. I'm like, was that a Breaking Bad quote? Wait a minute, did I see that? Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
I used to love that show. But Joseph Bork, Borquet, I hope I'm saying your name. Oh no, it's not Joseph. Someone else asked this question. That actually the correct quote for Breaking Bad? Because somebody, I think it was yay science, and then the internet added science bitches.
quite possibly, and I won't. I will take artistic license on that one, but I won't say that was an accurate transcription. Hopefully, I haven't offended anyone too greatly with that one.
Oh no, not at all, not at all. No, I vote for the paraphrasing. I totally do. But listen, we're almost to the hour, not quite. So I know when I ask you, there's some questions here. It's going to take us a little bit past 8. Are you okay?
I'm absolutely, as long as people are happy. I
Okay.
got nothing to do. I have a beer. I can good.
I did this all wrong. I should have had a glass of wine instead. I have coffee. I don't know. Yeah, I planned my evening very poorly. But I will, since I mentioned Joseph's name, Joseph wants to know: isn't pseudoscience just lazy emotional thinking?
I think there's an argument that you could say that, but I'm not sure it's lazy. It's certainly emotional. It is absolutely emotional. But I sometimes they go to great efforts where they're not being lazy. They're going through some kind of intellectual acrobatics to avoid the truth. But I think the word emotional is absolutely true. I think that there's a thing in psychology that I will try to explain badly called identity protective cognition. The problem is when you commit to an idea, you start defining yourself by it. So when people attack the
Um,
idea, you start, instead of going, well, yeah, maybe I'm wrong about that. If someone tells you, hey, your favorite sports team are terrible, do you ever notice you get very angry? I don't have a favorite sports team. It's a bad example.
right.
But you get irrationally angry at that, or a lot of people do. And the reason why is we started identifying our ideas as a projection of ourselves, which of course they are not. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily lazy, but it
Mm,
certainly is emotional. And trying to dispassionately take that. So one of the things I do when I deal with, particularly with vaccine hesitant parents, is kind of going, okay, that's interesting. So why do you believe that? And I listen to, and they tell me, and then I kind of go, that's really interesting. Here's what I think. It's a really weird strategy because it's not what I used to do. I used to go in shaking my fists and that
right,
didn't get
right.
me very far. I think if you plant the seeds for people to change their mind, it's more productive than, I mean, that's for even the word lazy. I'm not saying it is lazy, but I think if you say someone's being lazy, they don't take
Yeah.
kindly to it, and it's kind of, you've lost them at the word go.
Right. And I think that also answers Clifford's question a little bit. He asked, what is the best way to change the minds of anti-vaxxers? And, what you just said, planting the seeds and not
And
shaking the
also here,
finger.
I think when you find anti-vaxxers, one of the things I found is often their fears are actually not necessarily about the vaccines. They're just scared and looking for answers and don't know. Now, some of them, there's a spectrum.
Yes. Yes.
There's a Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s and Andrew Wakefields of this world who will always lie through their teeth. But the people that get caught up in this are often just scared parents or scared people trying to do their best. And all you have to do then is show them that the alternative explanation from what they've heard, which is the scientific one, is better than what the quacks are telling them. And it's a gentle, it's like diffusing something gently rather than going in and hitting someone with a baton over the head. It's hard to do because you get really mad. I mean, you have to kind of
Yeah.
bite your tongue a bit, but it's probably more effective in the long term.
Um, Daniel wanted to know, has there ever been a time in history where disinformation is so rampant? And if so, what was the cure then?
That's a great question. I actually don't know. I suspect like
Mm,
disinformation, the word different is desinformatia in Russian, and it was coined in roughly 1920, somewhere between 1990 and 1923. As we know it now is viral propaganda. I think that there's always been misinformation for sure. But I think that the sheer the communication avenues opened by the internet have been like a Pandora's box for us. I think we're overwhelmed with it, but there's no easy way for me to make that comparison because I think it's a very understudied problem. It's a great question. I don't have a good answer to it, apart from the fact that I would imagine there's more now solely due to the fact that there's more avenues to disseminate it, and that's a problem.
yeah, yeah. Michael wanted to know, is there evidence that some HPV vaccine resistance is related to sex in that it is sexually transmitted?
Absolutely. Yeah, there is. In fact, in America, for example, a lot of the opposition to the HPV vaccine, and one of the things that thwarted a national drive was the abstinence only or the abstinence education movement, if you call them, or oxymoronically that, who were arguing that it would make girls more promiscuous. There was 3 studies done that found that actually, I think the irony of this is that girls that got the vaccine were not having sex any earlier than their peers that didn't, and we all know abstinence only education is pretty poor. That was a big thing in the US for absolutely. It's probably a thing in Ireland too, even if it's not verbalized that way. But yes, it definitely had it was a factor. But I think the bigger factor was the hardcore anti-vaccine movement because they use the same claims they use for every other vaccine. They're not even creative. I wish they were more creative, but they're just not.
Well, they're going with a winning strategy, so they think. So,
Well, they
they
unfortunately they're
repeat
kind
their
of
best
right. It
hits.
seems to work.
Yeah.
So
Uh, and is there anywhere, Iris, thank you, Iris, is there anywhere in the world where false believing is not taking such a hold as in the US? Like, are there people who are better at this than us?
you see, I know the US gets a lot of flack for this kind of stuff, but actually, I will say that the stats on people who believe conspiracy theories roughly correlate in the UK and US, which are very different countries, and they're the
Mm,
ones where it's most studied. So I would say this is kind of universal. We know with vaccine hesitancy, it's a universal thing. Um, so it's easy to go, oh, it's partly education. It is true that good education reduces that kind of stuff, but it doesn't absolutely eradicate it. And I think this is a universal human experience. We're all being affected by it, I'm afraid.
No, thank you. Norman, I don't know if he brings up a good point or an interesting point. I will throw it out here. He said, I agree that big pharma and other corporate entities do not suppress cancer cures. However, there was a conspiracy between the major car manufacturers and oil production companies to suppress electric vehicles. How do you determine what is conspiracy bogus and true fact?
That's a good question. There are conspiracies. I actually did a paper on this in 2016 and another one this year, doing a mathematical model. So if you want to see how long a conspiracy would hold if you were going to have a conspiracy, so the conspiracy he mentions was exposed. So whenever people tried, Watergate was exposed. Plenty, Edward Snowden's prison leaks were exposed. So I did the maths of this about 5 years ago, looking at okay, if I wanted to have a big pharma conspiracy, how likely, and it turns out you can do the maths of this and work out that big conspiracies incredibly difficult to withhold that information for long periods of time. So you could try to get together and do conspiracies, but unless you keep them very, very small, they're not going to hold. So when people say, well, big pharma have a conspiracy, I'll be like, with an organization with millions upon millions of people involved in some capacity, keeping a secret. Benjamin Franklin famously said that three men could keep a secret if two of them were dead. And I think
Yeah.
I think he was being optimistic at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely. Because I just tweeted it. I'm kidding. I will. There's so many good questions here, and I'll wrap up with two more if I can.
Sure.
Just since I have you here, Lara asks a good question. As an educator, where do I start to support critical thinking growth?
That's a great question. I lecture. My brother's a teacher. Almost all my family are involved in education in some way, and I think that all we can do as skeptics or people that think skeptically, we can just encourage questions and try to give honest answers. And I think sometimes the hardest thing to do, because especially as a teacher, as an educator, you often feel you have to have the answers. I mean, I sometimes feel that pressure when students ask me something. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is, I don't actually know. That's a really good question. Let's try to work out the answer. And I think there's no shame in not knowing. There's no shame in. I think the education model as a teacher being the all-knowing demigod is definitely misguided, and there are some educators that still try to. But I think fostering that environment where asking questions is encouraged, and also admitting that some questions are hard and there's no easy answers to them is great as well.
Mm, okay. Thank you for that. And someone asked about your book. Will it be available as an audiobook?
Absolutely. I just finished the
Yay.
recording of it this week in Dublin. It'll be mastered next month, and I'm hoping available by the end of next month. It might be a while, but it will be available. It's just they had to get me to re-record the whole thing. I'd already done it for the UK edition, but the American edition is all updated, and
Oh,
there's a lot more in it. So it's 15 and a half hours long. So enjoy that.
wow. Wow.
I want to give people value for money. If they're going to get it, they're going to get a lot of information. So that's the one review I got. Was it's really good, but you put a lot into it. I'm like, if you're going to buy a book, you don't want to go. There's not enough in it, do you?
And this might seem as an awkward question, since we're talking about your book, but are there are there some other book recommendations that you can make for people
Yes,
as well?
absolutely. So the kind of books on this kind of stuff that I absolutely love. I love Carl Sagan. Candle in the Dark still it came out in '95. It still holds up. Before the internet, before all that stuff, and yet it's still so relevant. I highly recommend that. But what I always say is, and obviously I love a lot of Dawkins's work, and there's loads of people of the popular science writer I could recommend. But what I recommend people read is history. It's fascinating, and we were chatting about this before, but
Yes, we were.
I mean, just reading like people like Tom Holland, I love. Just it sounds weird because like that's not anything to do with critical thinking, but if you see the mistakes people have made before, and you start seeing the
Yeah.
patterns in human behavior and the mistakes in reasoning we make, it's quite eye-opening. So I know it's a vague answer, but it's one. I hope that's good.
No, no, you gave some authors and an area to sort of expand your mind that we might not have thought of before. So yeah, yeah, reading history. I totally agree. I totally agree. Um, David, thank you so much for your time and expertise today and
You're
really
more
cool
than welcome. And I
slides.
know there's loads of other questions, but if people want to find me on Instagram or Twitter or smoke signals, whatever, where they want to get in touch, I will try to answer stuff as well. So if that helps.
Yeah, no, you're very cool on Twitter, by the way.
uh,
So yeah, I know it's Twitter, it's zero, but yeah, folks, you heard that. So I mean, I'm sorry that we don't have time to get to all the questions here. We rarely can get to all of them. I try to get to as many as I can. And David, I thank you for your generosity for going a little bit over the hour.
oh,
We
it's
do
my
appreciate
pleasure.
that. And I want to remind everybody who's watching that if you missed anything or if you came in late, there is a recording of this, and it will be available tomorrow at Skeptical Inquirer skepticalinquirer.org so you can go back and catch what you missed. And I invite you to please join us on July 8th for an ET talk with Seth Shostak. And I want to say, give my thanks to Skeptical Inquirer, to the Center for Inquiry, to our producer, Mark Kreidler, in the background, making sure that all goes well, and to you, the audience, for spending your time with us this evening. My name is Leanne Lord. Thank you and good night. Hi, David. Thank you.
Good night.